Chapter 26. Upon his return to Arcades, Lamont had thought for certain that he would face strict punishment, but his brother had a talent for surprising him, and made this occasion no exception. He was instead greeted with great joy, and despite his newfound fear of Vane, he couldn't resist running to him at full speed when he first saw him in the throne room. Vane, in turn, at first seemed ready to chastise the child, but was immediately taken by the same sweeping emotion, and in an instant fell to his knees, scruffing up Monty's hair and embracing him until he wheezed for breath. Gabranth stood by silently, as always.
"God, you little punk!"
Vane exclaimed with a laugh.
"Do you have any idea how worried I was?"
"Sorry," Monty replied, trying to quell his own laughter. Vane at last pushed the child back to take a good look at him, but did not seem happy with what he found. Monty's eyes still held their usual sparkle, but his face had turned gaunt, and a certain unnameable weariness appeared to possess him.
"Oh, my!"
Vane said concernedly, smoothing the boy's hair back in place.
"What?"
Monty asked, mirroring the expression.
"I hope you'll forgive me for saying so, little brother, but you look like hell." "I feel like hell."
He took the boy's face in his hands and pressed their foreheads together.
"Don't ever scare me like that again." "I'll try."
Vane finally realized his inappropriate tendency to coddle his brother and stood. After all, he had to act in their father's stead now.
"I can't believe you just took off like that,"
he said in a weak attempt at his boldest tone.
"You're lucky to be alive." "I know."
Monty's gaze fell to his feet hesitantly.
"I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I just wasn't, really, thinking properly, after Father died." "There's nothing wrong with that, but you could have just come to me, you know I'll always make time for you."
Then the realization of the true problem with the situation dawned on him, subtly dimming the light of his eyes, turning their muddy depths that much more impenetrable.
"Where did you go, anyway?"
he asked.
"Well,
Monty gulped.
"I was scared, and I didn't know what to do, so." "Rabanastre,"
Gabranth interrupted. Vane turned him with a look of inquiry.
"I found him in Rabanastre with Penelo." "Who?" "His, lady friend." "Ah."
Lamont smiled uncertainly. He had grown skilled in lying over the years, but he hadn't the slightest idea how to fool his brother.
I didn't mean to."
Vane took heed of his stuttering, but thankfully, Gabranth stepped in once more.
"It's all right, Monty. Don't be shy. I just wanted to see her again. She cheers me up, you know." "I see,"
said Vane.
"Well, next time, why don't you just tell me and I'll arrange to have her brought here? We can't have you wandering about in public unprotected, especially now that everyone knows about you." I understand." "Are you sure you're all right?" "Why, yes. Nothing else you need to tell me?" "No."
Vane looked him over intently, holding eye contact with a cautionary concern that seemed to border on suspicion, and Gabranth carefully stepped in once more.
"Lord Vane."
The Emperor looked up, a threat behind his eyes that even Monty took note of.
He's just a little embarrassed,
Gabranth said quietly.
I kissed her,
Monty added, drawing his brother's attention far faster than he had intended.
You what?
Asked Vane. Monty took in a deep breath.
I told you I wasn't thinking.
This changed Vane's expression entirely, and he once more mussed the boy's hair.
Well, you little scoundrel. If there was ever a legitimate reason to run away, that would have to be it. I hope she didn't slap you.
Monty grinned nervously, but could not muster a response, though he was lucky enough to be interrupted anyway, as Zargiboth entered behind him.
Your Excellency? A word.
Quickly losing the light in his eyes, Vane nodded to him.
Right.
And then, addressing his brother once more,
go clean yourself up. We can talk more over dinner.
Lamont nodded.
Okay.
He turned and headed for the door, but Gabranth lingered for a moment, glancing first toward the former prince and then toward the new emperor. Zargiboth mirrored the expression, and, after a second of suspense, Vane rolled his eyes and nodded after his brother. Gabranth left. In the hall, Monty stared forward vacantly, the closest he came to pouting any more, and Gabranth walked at his side in heavy-hearted silence, knowing full well what soon would come. He'd have none of it, though. In spite of everything, Monty still failed to recognize the grave threat that his brother posed, and if he would not take the necessary precautions, Gabranth would for him.
You didn't have to do that,
the boy said stonily.
Yes, I did,
the judge groaned in return.
I may be young, Gabranth, but I know how to take responsibility for my own actions. You committed treason. So? What's he going to do about it? Kill me?
Gabranth bit his tongue. Luckily, the ever-burdening helmet masked his expression, hiding the shock on his face from Lamont, who heeded his silence by turning his gaze to the floor and saying, gently,
I know he did it. Monty, your father's murderers have been tried and convicted. And executed, I know, but that doesn't change anything. Drace knew what she was doing. She always did.
Monty seemed to withhold a sigh, clearly believing him, but on some level not wanting to.
Did you get to talk to her? Before? She was at peace with it,
Gabranth said quietly.
Her last thoughts were of you. I won't let him do that to you,
Monty insisted.
Don't worry about me,
he replied, tasting blood. His mind ached, and for a moment he felt quite old, but other thoughts pressed these back into the shadows, forcing him to mull over the rather amazing talent he had developed for lying as of late. But it didn't surprise him. Vane had only to threaten Gabranth with relief of his duties to cow him into submission. It had brought him to the point that he no longer even knew who he had become, much less how or why he had become it, and some dark thought always managed to creep into his considerations of it, to comfort him with assurances of necessity, to convince him that the benefit outweighed the cost. It frightened him more than anything but losing Monty, of course. Monty, for his part, remained largely unknowing of this, looking to his feet, to the mundanely passing marble floor, wishing to return to an age when all his ills could be cured with a hug and a bedtime story.
It's strange,
he said.
I thought I'd hate him forever, but I don't know. It's harder than I thought it would be. I suppose that's a good thing,
Gabranth replied quietly. Monty's eyes now turned to the side, determined but unsure.
What happened between you and Bosch?
Gabranth's voice remained sturdy, but his tone softened.
What does it matter? Well, hasn't it been long enough? I think you two are far more alike than you want to admit.
The boy had gathered the courage to look up to him as he spoke, but Gabranth would not allow himself the weakness of meeting his eyes.
If you say so. Can't you just talk to each other? It's complicated. A girl. A country.
Adorably dismayed, Monty returned his gaze to the floor briefly before leveling it straight ahead.
Who started it? I did, of course. What if you didn't?
He pressed.
Would you forgive him? I'd try,
Gabranth said coldly.
I can't know for sure. How can you not know? Do you know why Vane does what he does?
The boy's face seemed to dim, his expression dropping into furrowed discontentment, and at length he shook his head, trying to force his heart to slow.
I never thought he'd do this. I'm sure he never thought he would either,
Gabranth added.
That doesn't help.
Gabranth withheld a sigh, lamenting that his only purpose had so suddenly become consoling Monty, but at the same time swelling with pride that only he could fill such a position. Somehow he felt that he had always been a father. His father remained perpetually distracted with military business, and his mother struggled to make ends meet on the farm. Someone had to help her. Someone had to look after Bosch. Even in the army, he had outranked Bosch. When he joined the Arcadian ranks, completely on his own, for once, he had found himself drifting with such a lack of responsibility, burdening himself with laborious duties to keep his mind apart from his sorrow. Technically, he was older than Bosch, and he had never passed up an opportunity to remind him of this, but since the fall of Landis their roles had completely reversed. Suddenly Bosch had his head on straight and Gabranth just took what came his way and ran with it. He didn't have the same tact for it that his brother had, though, and it wore on him every day, doubly without Drace. But he refused to submit himself to a futile battle. He had seen too many of his countrymen give their lives for a vain hope and a lost cause, and he could not bear the shame of it, much less the pain. He understood in some shadowy way that he had surrendered himself to the will of evil, but he could not live with the thought of surrendering without profit or dignity. He could not handle the way in which so many others pledged their lives to a stubborn monarch and a foundering army, or how he'd feel such a mindlessly faithful hound to cling so to a fallen kingdom. Bosch could do it, though. Bosch was strong like that. He remembered biting back a remorseful laugh upon the bittersweet revelation that Bosch had joined the resistance, no surprise there. But Gabranth understood his feelings on the matter. After all, Arcadia had taken far more from Bosch than it had from Gabranth, and in his youth he'd held a distaste for compliance, anyway, as had his wife. Before they married, Gabranth had feared he'd have two siblings to keep out of trouble, but in the end she figured out how to tame Bosch, though it was a secret she insisted she could not share. He had very much admired his sister-in-law, for her bubbly optimism and for her skill in recognizing one from the other, but mainly for her ability to make his brother so purely happy. She had been the perfect match for Bosch, and he often imagined that Bosch would think Drace the perfect match for him, or at least that he'd claim to for the sake for getting a rise out of him. Somehow his recent punishment seemed fair, though he would ever lament the unfortunate fact that an innocent woman had died for his sins. At times, he wished that he himself would be dealt a proper end, but he could not allow such misfortune to befall Monty. Monty. Without Bosch or Drace, there was only Monty, and even he served as a constant penalty. From the day he first laid eyes on the boy, when he lifted him from his cradle and instantly turned his cries to laughter, much to the chagrin of Drace and Gramis, from the very moment he met him, he wondered how he could deserve such happiness. He simply could not understand the reasoning behind this unearned reward, and to this day remained utterly baffled as to why he should be given all that had so violently been torn from Bosch. Gabranth forsook his home and his blood, and from it received an empire and a family, and yet at best, he'd almost had a nephew, or a niece. Or perhaps both, twins ran in the family. He wondered now if his punishment had been delayed, if he'd been given this joy for the sole purpose of losing it. In such a case, he would not complain. Perhaps in the end, Bosch would betray him and Arcadia would fall, and then their fates would at long last be equalized. In spite of it all, he felt it a shame that Bosch hadn't been able to watch Monty grow. Even if he lost Monty now, he'd had more than Bosch ever had, and he hated himself for it. Every day he wanted to seek his brother out and apologize, but he had spent the last 2 years making his best efforts to no avail, and at heart he knew that words would not fix this. Words paled in the light of actions, and he had none of those to offer. Truthfully, he had never felt deserving of forgiveness, or indeed even worthy of his brother's attention, and with all that he felt, he had become certain that there was nothing he needed to hear and even less he needed to say. He had settled on it the day he returned from Nalbina, his payment for selling out his own brother. For a moment, Monty's joy made it worth the agony, but then he realized his great oversight. Such a traitor had no right looking after the dear boy, no right teaching him honor and respect and love. Monty deserved better than a murderous hypocrite. Somehow Drace saw this, somehow, she saw everything, but she never humored Monty when he sensed something amiss, and she never pressed Gabranth when he insisted he felt fine. Not a word was spoken that night in the kitchen. Both sat silently across from each other, drinking twice their usual, their feet intertwined beneath the table. She understood what he had done, what he had really done, and needed no details or excuses. He revered that in her. Of course, there had always been things that they did not speak of, their lives before the judiciary, their opinions of the war, their feelings for each other, their real names. It was a list of unfortunate length, but it kept suitable boundaries in place, and both knew that they needed that. He had once told her in Landesian that he loved her, barely a year after they had met, when he'd had perhaps a bit too much to drink and Monty had been too small to pick up on such things. They had just put the prince to sleep and were about to part for the night, and somehow he lost track of what he was thinking and what he was saying. Thank God he still thought in Landesian. He had apologized for the slip-up, the language had been banned, after all, blaming it on habit, but she paid this no heed, asking instead what it meant.
Good night,
he had told her, nearly choking when she nodded and repeated it back. It was nearly 7 years later that he discovered she had been fluent all along. But the world, it seemed, grew emptier by the day, and since he could not win back any of the comforts his own limitations had lost, he resigned to making use of what he still had, and spoke as soothingly as he could in light of his own sorrow.
Sometimes we do things we know we shouldn't do, things we don't want to do.
Lamont's voice quivered with disdain.
And he's emperor, so none of his decisions are his own. Your father told you that. Always. Justification,
Gabranth sighed.
I think so,
Monty agreed.
Vane may make his own decisions,
he went on steadily,
but he makes them on behalf of his people. It's easier to blame him than it is to understand him. I know. Just makes me wonder if he ever really loved me. Of course he loves you.
The strength of his voice surprised him, though Monty seemed to anticipate it.
You're brothers, nothing can ever change that. He just can't admit to himself that you're stronger and always will be.
Monty looked angry for a moment, his eyes trained low, broodingly conveying a silent accusation that Gabranth would know, or at least that he should know, but this expression soon passed, and he glanced briefly up at the judge before turning his gaze back down with awkward submission.
I've always wished you were my father,
he said softly.
You don't mean that,
Gabranth replied. Lamont looked up to him.
I do.
He still stared forward imperviously.
Then you shouldn't say it.